Hej och välkomna tillbaka till Erik Penser Banks Bolagsdag. Jag heter Claes Palin och är analytiker här på banken och följer hälsovårdssektorn. I may now switch to English because the next company to present today is Paxman, and to present the company we have the company's CEO, Richard Paxman. Very welcome, Richard. You may start
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Perfect, and you may start your presentation.
Wonderful. All right, really good to be here. Thanks very much. I promise to work on my Swedish next time. If we go to the next slide, this really just highlights exactly what we're here to talk about today, and it's addressing an unmet need, which is chemotherapy-induced alopecia. And we'll talk a little bit about peripheral neuropathy. The main focus today will be talking about our scalp cooling device. If we look at the next slide, what we talk about really is that burden of cancer. So there's over 18 million new cases of cancer every single year. In fact, none of us in this presentation have probably not been touched by cancer at some point. But many millions of those patients will unfortunately have to go through chemotherapy treatment, and many millions of those will lose their hair. So this gives us a huge opportunity to support patients at a really difficult time in their lives. If we look at the next slide, what we've started to see is that scalp cooling is really becoming more and more common throughout the world. That awareness is increasing massively, not only just about hair retention, but also hair regrowth. And I think the importance of that is as we've shifted ways to looking at more of an integrative and holistic approach to treating our patients. We do know that chemotherapy-induced alopecia is one of the most feared side effects in our patients. It's one of the most traumatic because it's so visible. It leads to social isolation and can often affect patient self-image, even more than breast surgery. And there is a patient population who will actually refuse chemotherapy because of hair loss, so really affecting outcomes. So it prevents the patient's desire for that privacy or that normalcy, which we all really want. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our why, and that's really shown in terms of our passion for what we do. When I was just a young boy, my mum was diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer. She was in her 30s, 4 young children, and didn't want to lose her hair like many cancer patients. She was actually offered something called scalp cooling all those years ago, but for my mum it didn't work. That was the first time she was really affected by her disease and poor prognosis. Seeing that distress, my father was determined to do something about it. So as a family, we've developed the technology for the last 20 years, improving it, advancing it, carrying out multiple clinical trials around the world, and more importantly and more recently, improving market access. We lost my mum 20 years ago, so this is something we're very passionate about, and all of our team are. If you look at our next slide, we just talk about our vision. So no matter where you are in the world, no matter what your income, which is important from an equity standpoint, you should have the chance to have access to scalp cooling. And we're going to make that happen. If we look at our next slide, we talk about how it works. So it's quite simple, thankfully. So what we're doing is we understand how chemo works, damaging the mitotic and metabolic processes in the cancer cells. Our hair cells are very similar to those cancer cells, so we cool to protect. We induce vasoconstriction, so restricting the blood flow and therefore chemo to the hair follicles. We also see a drop in metabolic rate, with cell division, therefore less targeted effect by that chemotherapy, especially important with taxanes. And then more recently in the in vitro work that we've done, where we've developed our own cell culture models, we see less drug diffuse through the cell membrane. But also see a drop in metabolic rate activity, apologies. The next slide just talks about our clinical data. We have the most clinical data published in scalp cooling, well over 8,000 study subjects. We've got randomized controlled trials, large real-world evidence studies, prospective studies, with lots of different ethnicities, different hair types, so really inclusive and diverse and good quality data. The reality is scalp cooling works in around 50 to 60% of patients where they don't require a wig or head cover and lose less than 50% of their hair. If we go to the next slide, We just look at our product. So we have two scalp coolers giving us flexibility, a single model treating one patient at once, a double model treating two patients at once. It's nice and compact, very simple to use. And what we do is we pre-cool the patient for 30 minutes before, during the chemotherapy, and then for 90 minutes afterwards. Minimal nursing supervision is needed, and we've started to understand how we adapt the ways we work in different parts of the world to make sure this is really embedded into daily practice. One important thing is we've got a single patient use and a reusable cooling cap as well, which helps us be flexible depending on the market we're operating in. Looking at the next slide, just talking about our company structure. So back in 2017, we decided to do an IPO on the First North Nasdaq. In fact, Erik Penser Banks were very helpful with us to do that all those years ago. The main focus was getting the working capital to launch our US business. We'd already got Swedish VC investment prior to that, so we already had a really close connection with Sweden. We had a very strong board covering lots of different skills and expertise, which really adds value to the business. Paxman AB owns Paxman Group, non-trading company. We have our UK entity, which is a manufacturing, marketing, service, really carries out the majority of the functions in the business. And then we have the Paxman US Inc., our newest part of the business, which is technically our distribution arm in the United States. If we look at our next slide, just talks about our people. This is an incredibly important piece. Since our IPO to today, we've grown from about 25 to 30 people. So what we are at now is over 70 people. We've got a very strong leadership team in many different expertise in our leadership team, and now a strong and growing team. We've got a number of open posts where we're looking to strengthen our US business, especially in light of the reimbursement news. And we're also strengthening our international business. So placing people strategically, which I'll talk about, but also making sure we can manage our growing distribution network. We look at our next slide. Just talking about our regulatory environment, we've got some amazing regulatory people internally now, which is good. And we need that to support this ever-burdening regulatory environment that we operate in. We have global standards throughout, and also a part of the single audit process. So very proud of what we've achieved and the ability to actually export our product to over 60 markets globally. If we take the next slide, this just says where we are today. So look at the UK for a good example of what we can achieve globally. We're in about 98% of the National Health Service, both in the private sector, public sector, and home healthcare sector. I believe we can do that everywhere else in the world. We have over 4,500 scalp coolers installed globally as of today, on a different number of business models, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if we can achieve what we've done in the UK, making it standard of care, we'll have an incredibly successful business. Looking at our next slide just talks a little bit about where we are in the US. So as I said, in the US, we launched in 2017, built a really strong infrastructure, actually using McKesson, one of the biggest medical companies in the world, if not the biggest medical company in terms of distribution in the world. We have a hub services out of Scottsdale, Arizona. We have a 3PL in Kentucky. We have an office out of Houston, and then we have people strategically installed in different parts of the country. We've now installed over 900 scalp coolers in about 400 locations in 40 states and treated well over 9,000 patients, albeit we're just scratching at the surface. We've got so much more to do in this market. We're in some of the biggest names, so we're in the largest academic centers, MSK, Mayo, Cleveland Clinic, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dana-Farber, Mass General, you name it, we have installations. We also work with the US Oncology, the largest community oncology group in the United States. On the next slide, we just talk about the different business models. Ultimately, we want to move to the majority of our revenues becoming recurring revenues. That's the most important. So not selling capital equipment as such, but getting that per patient treatment, which is really our US model. However, we have a bit of a hybrid in other markets, such as Mexico, where we've got a licensing model with Teva. We've got a mixture of work in Japan, which is a great potential for us, where we sell capital equipment and a consumable cooling cap. So what we're trying to do is be as flexible as possible, but ultimately long-term, want to move to this recurring revenue streams. We just talk about our revenue growth. So from 2017 to 19, we saw about 300% growth, a lot of that coming from the US, but also a real increase in our overseas sales as well. We were hit by COVID, of course. Many of our distributors pivoted, looking to do other things. So we actually saw a decline in our rest of world markets, which are distributor-led, but we still saw an increase of 10% in our US business. 2021 back to that decent growth levels again, not quite as where we were before, based on the first couple of quarters, but quarter 3 and quarter 4 again showing some consistent and strong growth. And in fact, quarter 4 of 2021 was our best quarter as yet, and profitable. If we look at the next slide, just shows the mix in revenues. This is really relating to what I talked about earlier, this mix in terms of recurring revenues versus capital equipment. So we do get some recurring revenues in our UK business that will increase and change in future, but look at our US subsidiary really now actually taking the lion's share in revenues. On our next slide, which I believe is about funding, just talks about the use of funding. So we raised about 30 million SEK originally when we did our IPO. Then we took on some debt to really expand our US business, increase our capital investments in that country, which really started to pay dividends. And then more recently, we've removed all our debt based on our directed issues. So we have no debt in the top company now, but have by the end of the year, we had about 70 million spare cash to invest and do the things that we need to do to grow. To date, we spent about 1.4 million pounds on reimbursement in the US, which is a key investment for us for growth. If we look at the next slide, please. This is a very busy slide, of course, but it does give a good idea of showing our growth. So nice growth in sales. Again, look at that real growth from Q3 to Q4 2021. And that's what we've got to achieve and continue to achieve. And we're confident of meeting those levels for the year. Looking at our expenditure, of course, those have increased based on volume, but also additional investments in people, now exhibitions, travel, etc. Whereas in 2020, we were benefiting from furlough schemes, PPP loans in America, and we weren't traveling. But now we're back on the road investing. What's really positive to see is a decent EBITDA in that quarter 4, and for the year, a positive EBITDA, which we're very proud of. It's important to understand we have high levels of depreciation running through the business, primarily relating to the fact that we install a lot of equipment in the US. If we look at our next slide, this just shows you very quickly our increasing utilization figures in the US. We're very pleased with this, but again, scratching at the surface. There is much of a huge market in the US in terms of our potential. You know, as I said, a few hundred patients per month we could be doing a few thousand patients per month. Looking at our next slide, this really talks about that global feel again and how much more we've got to do. So if we move to our next slide, it talks about the directed issues we carried out. So in the early 2021, we took a directed issue out, really because we'd proven ourselves throughout COVID, done very well, but wanted to invest more in reimbursement, which is now paying off, but also more into our international program. So we focused on internationalization and reimbursement, which has really paid dividend by the end of the year. We then, based on some very positive news from CMS and lots of institutional interest in our company, we decided to do a directed issue again at the end of the year, which has ultimately now reduced our debt and borrowing in the top co, but also given us a huge war chest to grow and really look at reimbursement, buy and bill model, further internationalization and research and development. So an exciting 2022 for Paxman. If we go to the next slide, this just talks about where we're strategically putting people in the market. So internationalization, India, such a key growth market, Scandinavia with you guys, we need to do more. France, Germany, 2 amazing European markets, Canada, and of course, America. If we look at the next slide, here we talk about the business model strategy, and hopefully you've got some questions for me about this, but this is the biggest potential change in our business. Paxman have led the way in terms of making the changes here in the United States, in terms of changing our business model, working with providers, working with payers, getting the CPT codes, lobbying for legislation, and also getting on the guidelines. And now we're finally starting to see some benefit here. If we look at the next slide, this will show that we're on the guidelines, which is a huge thing and a signaler of standard of care. We've of course got FDA clearance, we've got CPT codes, and there was also a new APC rate associated with hospital outpatients scalp cooling treatment up to $1,850 per patient. So gone are the days of us questioning whether scalp cooling will be reimbursed. Today it will be reimbursed, if that makes sense. On our next slide, this just talks about that news I was talking about. So ultimately, the government payer are now saying that scalp cooling should be and will be covered, and that started to kick in as of the 1st of January. And if we look at our next slide, that's what we're doing now in terms of changing our business model. So we currently have a self-pay business model in the US, which has been successful, but has limitations. Patients can't all afford. So if we move to our next slide, and then our next slide after that, what you'll see is we're moving to what we call a buy and bill model with a patient assistance program. This really sets us apart, where we have the ability now to use a distributor called McKesson. Again, I've talked about them before, who will sell the cooling cap at a fixed price, and they will use the CPT codes to cover their costs of providing that service. What's really good is we're offering a really strong support network, doing benefits investigations, prior auths, and also appeals. What's the most important thing is for me and for our customers is that we have a patient assistance program in the background as well, really supporting those patients that don't have cover and don't have the resources to help to afford scalp cooling. So it has to be equitable, and that's something that we're being able to do with this new business model. On the next slide, it just shows you a fuller overview of our buy and bill model. Quite complex, but we go live on April the 1st, and we're incredibly excited. We've had so much interest from our providers to date. If we look at the next slide, we talk about research and development. So we're working on the future of cooling caps and something topical as well. The idea being able to really enhance efficacy, but also provide better and future options for consumables. And I think we're having some breakup in my screen, but what the next slide just talks about peripheral neuropathy. So if we go to the next slide after that, it gives you an idea of what the device looks like. We're developing a cryocompression device used to help cancer patients with that unmet need, chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. We have a research plan with the National University of Singapore, and we're also developing a clinical trial in the United States to look at over 400 patients. And we're hopeful we should get approval on that clinical trial very soon. Our next slide talks a little bit about funding, and that we have funding in place, but we also raised additional funding through our directed issue to support if necessary. But we're incredibly excited about this opportunity for peripheral neuropathy. And I believe we are at the end of our slides if we go to the next slide. So thank you very much. I think I ran over by a couple of minutes, but it's a pleasure to be here and would very happily answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much for the presentation, Richard. And I have a couple of questions, and I would like to start with the reimbursements, of course. I mean, how satisfied are you with the reimbursement level?
Okay, so I think it's a good start. Of course, what we'd like to try and achieve is a greater value. So reimbursement's been provided from Medicare for that first code, 0662T, which is actually the fitting and placement of the cooling cap. And that's at $1,850, but they've bundled the second code for Medicare. What we'd like to see ultimately is a larger fee for the first code and then a specific payment amount for the second code as well. But that will take a little bit more time. Ultimately, what we need to do is start billing these payers to capture information and understand who's paying what and how much they will pay. It's a bit of a chicken and egg. So when we launch our business model on the 1st of April, we should be able to start capturing much more important data. Ultimately, that's the value that's going to the physician and their office and hospital, not Paxman or another scalp cooling provider. And
how are you progressing with reimbursement from private insurance companies in the US. Are they also interested in providing
Yes, so
reimbursement?
good engagement, but again, it's a slow process. One of the key things that we've wanted to do, regardless of even the Medicare news, is start billing, start using those CPT codes,
Yeah.
creating pressure. So, albeit no really strong signals of yes, we are covering, and we'll let everyone know when they are. We're getting positive feedback.
And just out of curiosity, you reported a quite strong Q4. How much is it possible to break that down? How much of the income is reimbursed compared to out-of-pocket pay?
You're better off just thinking it's all reimbursed, it's out-of-pocket pay. So
Okay.
ultimately, even when a patient is going for reimbursement in the current model last year, they were all paying out-of-pocket and self-pay. So consider it all out-of-pocket.
And looking outside of the US, I mean, if you just could give us some sort of a status update, how the reimbursement looks like.
So we operate very different models in different parts of the world. So there's less focus on reimbursement because it's purchasing of the capital equipment. However, as we start to implement new models where there is consumable elements and perhaps a patient model, reimbursement will become more important. Japan is a good example of that. Initially, there was no reimbursement. We've just got on the guidelines in Japan, and they're called appearance guidelines, and ultimately that will hopefully help start to make payer coverage decisions different.
Okay. And you have quite a healthy balance sheet at the end of 2021. And where do you see you will invest most heavily in 2022 and going forward? Is it to expand your sales force, or is it in the new potential product in the CIPN? Or maybe both, of course.
Most focus in 2022 will be on the reimbursement model. So ensuring we have the right infrastructure to launch. So as I said, we launch on the 1st of April with our buy and bill model, but we have to have funding for our PAP program. We have to have reimbursement field service support, which we've already started employing, and actually just general more support for our hospitals. We're less about a sales team. And fortunately for us, signing up with someone like McKesson, ultimately we add to our sales team because they're out there pushing our product too. Same with the GPO that we're looking to sign with as well. So sales is less of a focus. This is more about support and launching this buy and bill model.
And in the US, do you want to do this all by yourself, or are you looking for some sort of a partner to help you out to even further reach out to the patients?
So it's our own subsidiary, but ultimately we use McKesson as I've sort of just alluded to. So they will be our support from an infrastructure, marketing to some extent, but actually very much delivery and distribution.
Great. And if you want to comment on, what is kind of gross margins do you have on your consumable part of your business?
A good question. I'll just talk about the gross margins for all of our business.
Sure.
You can see which is all pretty much in line. It's anywhere between 60 and 70% our gross margins, so relatively strong. Our view is that we want to try and improve those margins throughout. But of course, that takes a little bit of time when launching things like patient assistance programs, which ultimately affect margins. And COVID, current pandemic, also eat away at margins and the sad news in Ukraine, but not to a massive extent for us.
And as you are a listed company in Sweden, you have a direct competitor listed in Sweden as well. I just wonder, what would be the difference between your two products?
I think the biggest difference is the name above the door. Ultimately, they're both offering good technology, providing scalp cooling. So in terms of mechanisms, both work exactly the same. I think how we do things is slightly different. Research pipelines, perhaps the way we deliver cooling slightly, our cooling caps. But ultimately, when you use both devices properly, in the right way, we get both companies get very comparable and good clinical data. So either option is a good option in my view for a patient.
Sounds great. And one of my last questions then will be just to understand how you are. You have some sales in Russia, or will you continue to do business in Russia, given what has happened recent?
We actually have orders in the pipeline for Russia, but of course, with the current climate, that's something that we are hanging back at the moment. Again, we don't want to get into a political situation, but yeah, it's a difficult one. I think the most focus is making sure that the issues are resolved as quickly as possible and people are as safe as possible, and we will figure out the commercial side of things in the future. It's not core business, and yeah, it shouldn't affect us either way too much.
And your two largest markets today is the US and the UK, if I understand you correctly. And do you see other markets that's really interesting that you want to expand to? Or, I mean, you are present at a lot of markets, but where you see good growth opportunities in sort of a short to medium term perspective?
Yeah, Japan has to do well this year, and I'm very confident. So that's where we put a lot of investment. And we're also quite interested about France and Germany, as well as the Middle East. But longer term, China has to be somewhere where we're interested in. And I forgot to mention India as a key market. I put it on that slide: India, France, Germany, interesting markets.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Richard, for the presentation and for answering my questions.
No problem. Good to be here, and look forward to doing it again sometime.